beyond the bony labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Muns. Episode 4: Why music is not a language. It is a truism that is denied as often as it is brought up, the idea that music is a language. The slogan, "Music is a language," remains mesmerizing, as if it contains profound wisdom. If it sounds profound, perhaps it is precisely because we know it is not true, not literally anyway. But it is hard to say exactly what may give it a ring of truth. It promises deeper understanding, but conceals its own obscurity. Theodor Adorno put it this way: music is similar to language, but music is not language or a language. Its similarity to language directs us to the core, but also into vagueness. If we think of it literally as a language, we will be led astray. Thus Adorno. That music is language or a language, taken literally, is evidently nonsense. We don't speak music like we speak English. We don't order a sandwich, make an appointment, or discuss the meaning of music in music. We can deliver a telegram singing, or hold a conversation as if it were opera, but the message is in the words, not in the music. Perhaps that slogan, "Music is a language," is just a metaphor, meaning music has similarities to language. Just as body language is a bit like language, or, according to another popular slogan, fashion is a language. In this case, clothes are used to make a statement, or rather to express an attitude. I'm cool, I'm macho, I'm retro, I don't care how I look. People send signals by the way they are dressed. In this case, clothing has a communicative function, but the primary function is to clothe us. Communication is secondary and very limited anyway. That people carry on a conversation through their attire is perhaps conceivable, but certainly rare and above all highly impractical. Music may undoubtedly be communicative and expressive in a much richer sense than clothes. But saying that music is therefore metaphorically a language is missing an important point. An effective metaphor is a link between two things that are strikingly different in all other respects: language and fashion, a black sheep and a person who is disliked. Conceived as a metaphor, the slogan "Music is a language" obscures the fact that in interesting ways music is substantially similar to language. I therefore prefer to speak of an analogy. Metaphor too relies on analogy, a limited analogy, but analogies can also be broad and substantial. Like the analogy between plant and animal reproduction. Certain processes follow a similar pattern. That music would be a language is a thought that seems to have first surfaced in the 18th century. Usually that idea was, and is, linked to the supposed universality of music. Music is a universal language, understandable to all. and more specifically, a universal language of feeling or of the emotions. The origin of that idea is the insight that spoken language involves more than what is expressed with words. The sound aspect of spoken language is an essential part of communication. The intonation with which a sentence is spoken betrays something of the speaker's intentions and feelings, intentionally and unintentionally. The spoken sentence has a sequence of pitches, without the fixed stable tones we produce when we sing, and a somewhat vague kind of rhythm. It is therefore common to speak of speech melody, also referred to as prosody. The idea that music, through the influence of the prosody of spoken language, would itself be a kind of language, was a novelty in the 18th century, which quickly became a cliché. Immanuel Kant, for instance, was saying nothing new when he wrote the following in 1790. Every expression of speech has as a coherent whole an intonation appropriate to its meaning. This intonation indicates more or less an emotion of the speaker, which it produces also in the hearer. And just as this modulation is like a universal language of feelings, which every man may understand, music employs this independently and in its full force as a language of the emotions. In other words, the vocal expression that in language is an added element, namely speech melody, has developed into an independent language of feeling in music. That is what Kant argues. Kant was an older contemporary of Haydn and he outlived Mozart. And so the idea that music is a universal language of feelings arose at the same time as what we know as classical music in a narrow sense, and the music of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven. That the melody of speech expresses something of the speaker's intention that is not contained in the words is a familiar phenomenon. The shorter the written message, in a Twitter message or SMS, the greater the risk of the message being misunderstood, of the reader taking seriously what was not meant seriously, and so on. And this is why many people use emojis, which again can be misunderstood. Those who write more carefully try to suggest a melody of speech through word choice and sentence structure. Punctuation, commas, semicolons, hyphens plays an important role in this. They are in fact signs for prosody. This prosody of language plays an important role first of all in vocal music. Of course, the singing is almost always on a text. Spoken sentences are transformed into sung sentences. But instrumental music is largely shaped by the melodic structures found in vocal music. Until the late 18th century, until the time of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, most music was vocal music. Worldwide, this is probably still the case. Consequently, music has gradually taken shape under the influence of language, usually in the form of poetry. To that it owes much of its eloquence. Friedrich Nietzsche put it beautifully. Music is, in and of itself, not so full of significance for our inner being, so deeply moving, that it could be called an unmediated language of feeling. But through its primeval association with poetry, so much symbolism has come to be associated with rhythmic movement, with loudness and softness of tone, that it may now seem to us as if it were speaking directly to our inner being, proceeding from within. Thus Nietzsche. Poetic form is often recognizable in instrumental music. It is partly because of this that we can distinguish something like musical sentences with a beginning, middle, and a proper conclusion. Without really saying anything, this theme or phrase of Beethoven's has a certain eloquence or expression. That expression is largely in the prosodic aspects. We recognize a long melodic sentence built from half-sentences, phrases, each rounded but not fully closed, something like commas and semicolons. Comma, semicolon. Comma. Full stop. The analogy with language therefore is justified by something that is literally true. Music reflects or is partly shaped by the prosody of spoken language. This is literal truth number one. This is not very controversial, although it is striking how much this elementary insight has been neglected in music theory and music philosophy. It is an important key to what makes music meaningful. The analogy also rests on a second substantial similarity with language closely related to the first. Language is not exclusively spoken language. We strongly tend to identify language with speech, and worldwide that is the default form of language. It is expressed in the word language, langue, lingua, the Latin word for tongue, and the German Sprache. It is tempting to think that speech is the original proper form, but a human voice is not indispensable to language and perhaps not even essential. Speech or sound is merely the medium, and language is not dependent on it, as is evidenced by written language or sign language. What is decisive is the underlying structure, and that structure consists of a stock of signs, words, and rules for connecting these signs into new meaningful utterances, sentences. Syntax is a set of rules that allows us to make sentences out of words. We learn those rules spontaneously when we learn our mother tongue, or with a little more effort later and usually more consciously when we learn other languages. The operation of syntax is most clearly recognizable where it fails. John is going to sleep is a sentence, sleep John go is not, even though you could guess, just from the meanings of the word, what a speaker might intend. Music has no vocabulary, but it does have such a thing as sentences and rules on how these sentences are formed. We can relate the expressive flow of those phrases to prosody. This is mainly about melody, meter, and rhythm. The syntactic coherence of music is a matter of harmony, the succession of chords. Harmony is not something added to the melody as an accompaniment. The course of melody is largely contained in the harmony, with a lot of leeway. The same sentence by Beethoven can therefore also be viewed, listened to, from a syntactic point of view, a point of listening, I should say. And then we turn our attention to the harmonic changes. In language, using the same syntactic pattern, we can create sentences with very different meanings. God's ways are unfathomable, and smoking is damaging to your health have the same underlying form, subject, and predicate. In music, we can keep the harmonic structure while changing everything else, which can also drastically change the character or expression. You can hear this when a composer or improvising musician creates variations on a theme. The chord progression of Beethoven's theme and this variation are virtually the same. The foreground is quite different. As is the case with the syntax of language, we can illustrate musical syntax with a defective example. Here comes a rather dull but correct piece of music in the style of the mid-18th century. This is what linguists call grammatically correct, but it is not particularly interesting music. The piece is too predictable, too cliché. Nevertheless, predictability is an important factor in understanding and appreciating music. Musical syntax allows us to anticipate what might come next. Most music has a certain degree of predictability. You know roughly what might come from moment to moment. Music that is totally unpredictable is chaos. Music that is totally predictable is uninteresting cliché. Here's a piece with the same elements, but ungrammatically. Some listeners may prefer the ungrammatical piece precisely because it breaks the rules in unpredictable ways. But it doesn't change the fact that the piece is simply wrong by established standards. And we recognize that even if we find it more interesting. I do have to admit that it wasn't too easy to come up with this example of ungrammatical music, not as easy as Sleep John Go. Not because the music is complex, but because it is difficult to decide exactly what to do wrong, what is and is not part of musical syntax. Melody and harmony are inextricably bound together. I left the melody more or less intact. Melody, including rhythm, is most like the prosody of language. What gives music its formal coherence seems to be primarily the succession of chords, harmony. It is the rules of harmony that are sinned against in this ungrammatical piece. The analogy between language and music is substantial, but we should not take it too far. Music has no words, word inflection, parts of speech, or anything that fulfills similar functions. For the syntax of language, the sound element is irrelevant, but music exists only by the grace of sound. If we can detect an analogy between harmony and linguistic syntax, it is only because it can perform a function in music that is somewhat similar to that of syntax in language. Musical harmonic syntax has developed within classical music, the tradition of European music since the 16th century. With the spread of Western culture, classical music has become a global standard. But this dominance of the classical does not mean that the idiom, and with it harmonic syntax, is universal or natural. Yet it is possible, and likely, that the same cognitive ability that makes a language possible also plays a role in musical syntax. This suspicion is confirmed in increasing detail by neurological research. There is an intriguing similarity in patterns of brain activity when we work with musical and linguistic sentences. We cannot say that the analogy between language and music applies to music generally, to all music. What we can say is that this analogy lies within the possibilities of music, or rather, of what we can do with music. It lies within our human ability to use music to create a language like sentences with head and tail and a certain grammatical sequence. Other kinds of music are made according to different rules. But it may be that the creation and recognition of musical coherence, of any meaningful musical connection, in other kinds of music too appeals to the capacity for language, a kind of instinct already prepared in the brain at birth, ready for use. It is still an unresolved question what exactly constitutes this universal, innate linguistic capacity. Perhaps its core is not specific to language. Perhaps we should speak of a language-music capacity, or of a syntactic capacity, which allows us to develop an infinite number of languages and infinitely many kinds of music. This was episode 4 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinth.